This will be the second lecture on the skeletal system, and today we will also talk about the joints. The photomicrograph you're looking at here shows the three different types of cells that are found in the bone tissue. Between these cells is a material which is called bone matrix. This material contains the calcium and is what makes bone what it is in terms of its strength and rigidity. The bone matrix is secreted by the osteoblasts and maintained by the osteocytes. And we will talk in detail about how this is formed in the next few slides. The osteocyte, which is shown in three different arrows are pointing at different osteocytes. These are mature bone cells that are surrounded by bone matrix, and they sit in a little cavern or a little cave called a lacuna. The osteoblasts, which are on the edge of the bone matrix, are what forms the bone, what forms the calcium and then lays down the forms the collagen and lays down the calcium to make the bone hard the way we know it. And then the large extracellular or multicellular cells that break down bone are called osteoclasts. So in this diagram you see the arrows pointing to the large osteoclasts, the smaller osteoblasts and osteocytes, as well as the bone matrix. Now, as I said, the space in the bone matrix where the osteocytes reside is called the lacuna. And each lacuna contains one cell or one osteocyte. The diagram on the left shows the principal form of calcium that is put in the bone matrix that makes up bone, and this is called the hydroxyapatite crystal. And this crystal is what makes up the hardness of the bone that we know about. On the right here is a picture of an individual with a problem known as rickets. And rickets occurs when there's a lack or a deficiency in hydroxyapatite. And it's fundamentally caused by vitamin D deficiency, which affects the ability of the body to absorb calcium and use it properly. And the bones contain a lot of collagen, but not enough calcium, and so they bend and become rubbery under weight bearing, and that's why they bow out, as you see in this picture on the right. Now there are two types of bone. There's what's known as cancellous or spongy bone, and the other kind of bone is known as compact bone. And many long bones, like the femur, contain both spongy and compact bone, or both cancellous and compact bone. The little beams of bone that make up the network within cancellous bone are called bone trabeculae. And on the left here you see a nice diagram which shows how these sort of form a lacy network. And within this network many times is where the bone marrow cells hide out and produce the blood. On the right, you see a typical osteon, which we will talk about more in the future, which has little channels between the various osteocytes, and these channels are called canaliculi. And on the outside there, you see the osteoclasts and osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are producing the bone, the osteoclasts are resorbing the bone. The various levels or layers of bone that look like rings on a tree are called lamella or bony lamella. So this is the cancellous bone and the bony trabeculae that form the cancellous bone. Now the other type of bone is the compact bone, which is shown on the diagram in the top. And what you see is to the left on that first diagram is some cancellous bone, but most of the bone on the right is compact bone. And compact bone are made up of tightly packed cylinders of bone called osteons. And osteons are made up primarily of bone matrix, and in the center of each of these is a central canal. And the central canal, which you can see there, is where the blood vessel travels up and down through the osteon and provides the blood that's needed to feed the osteocytes within the osteon. The osteons are made up of, as I said, rings, like rings on a tree, and those are called concentric lamellae of bone. Now there's also something called interstitial lamellae of bone, which is the bone that is not part of the osteon, that lies between various circles or various tubes that cylinders, I guess would be the best word to use. And you can see that there are little areas that connect one cylinder to another, and those are called interstitial lamellae. Now this is a diagram that shows how bone grows, and we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about this diagram. If you look at the diagram number 1, you have initially a very small, basically a chunk of hyaline cartilage. And in the center of that hyaline cartilage forms a bony collar around the middle of that. And this bony collar makes up what is known as the primary ossification center. And as the bone grows, the hyaline cartilage begins to grow out, the central aspect of the cartilage becomes deteriorated. And within that deterioration, more bony cells come in and they form bone in that area as well. And on the outside, in the primary ossification center, is a more compact area, and in the middle is the more cancellous area. And this cavern that forms within the cartilage model. Number 3 shows the continued growth of the hyaline cartilage, continued cavitation in the middle, and then what's known as the periosteal buds. And the periosteal buds are the areas that feed the bone with blood vessels and allow for the bone to continue to grow. It could not grow without a decent blood supply. Number 4 shows the next step, which is the formation of a second ossification center on each end of the bone. And the secondary ossification center is separated from the primary ossification center by the epiphyseal area. And the blood vessel that feeds the secondary ossification center is called the epiphyseal blood vessel. At last, on number 5, all the cartilage that's there eventually goes away except for a rim of cartilage known as articular cartilage, which acts as the cartilage between two bones. You have the spongy bone on each end of the bone, and this is then separated from the central part of the bone by the epiphyseal plate and the epiphyseal plate cartilage. Now, as the individual continues to grow, they only grow at the areas of the epiphyseal plate. And once a person reaches their full stature, then the epiphyseal plate will close and that person can no longer grow any further in height. Now, I use the term ossification center. Well, the ossification is the process where osteoblasts lay down bone matrix on cartilage that is calcifying, and it forms the new cancellous bone. And eventually, some of that will also become the outer part, or the compact bone that forms the outer part of the bone. And as I said, the line between the secondary growth center and the primary center is called the epiphyseal line. You remember from a previous chapter that the long section of the bone is called the diaphysis, and each end is called the epiphysis, and the line that forms between the two is the epiphyseal line. Now, the other thing that occurs in addition to growth is remodeling. And remodeling occurs, if you look at this diagram, in the left upper, you have a quiescent phase where the bone is not turning over. In the lower right, you also have the end, which is also a quiescent phase. So the lower right and the left upper are two situations that represent the same time point. And in between is what occurs during bone remodeling. And the bone is various bones are continuously remodeling. And bones remodel based on weight bearing and weight stress. And so when a weight stress occurs, then the osteoclasts come in, they remove bone and from a particular area based on signals they received based on weight bearing. Then the osteoblasts, this will be the third diagram on the right top part, right upper corner. The osteoblasts come in and begin to mineralize new bone. Then if you move down to the lower left, you see that the new bone is continuing to be rebuilt until you reach a later phase when the osteoid is then mineralizing, and then you have new mineralized bone. And this remodeling continues to occur. Now, I mentioned in class a few weeks ago something called Wolff's Law. And Wolff's Law states that the bone remodels based on weight-bearing stress. And you can have a significant impact on the bone remodeling if a person, for example, becomes bedbound or bedfast and can no longer get up and walk around. This has also caused a problem with people that went into outer space. In the weightless situation, the bone would tend to demineralize and they would develop premature osteoporosis, which is premature loss of bone structure. Now, the other type of growth that occurs is a growth in diameter, and this is also part of the remodeling process. And the growth in diameter is what's known as appositional growth. As I said, remodeling is this continuous process of reabsorption and then addition of bone that occurs as a person lives their life. Now, this slide shows how healing occurs when the bone is fractured. And the first stage of healing is the formation of a hematoma in the area of injury. Now, a hematoma is just a mass of blood that is limited to a confined space, and it can occur anywhere. And it basically helps to stabilize things and stabilize the ends of the bone until other processes can take place. At the next point, you have what's called the formation of fibrocartilage callus. And a callus is a mass of connective tissue that connects the ends of the broken bone. And so this connective tissue grows in from each broken end until they meet in the middle. And then if you look at number 3, this callus becomes more dense and more stable. And then lastly, the process of remodeling occurs and fixes or remineralizes the area and heals the bone. So this is the stages of bone healing. First you have hematoma formation, then the initiation of a fibrocartilage callus, then a bony callus formation, and then lastly bone remodeling until you can't actually tell that anything has occurred. Bone also undergoes active metabolism, and this is what I mean when I talk about bone homeostasis. There are 2 important hormones which we will talk about in this diagram that have to do with bone metabolism. The first of these hormones is called parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone is shown on the bottom half of the diagram, and it helps regulate calcium ions. And the effect of parathyroid hormone, as you can see, is when there's a release of parathyroid hormone, the bone gives up calcium, takes calcium or puts calcium into the bloodstream. There's a increased intake of calcium in the intestine and an increased reabsorption of calcium in the urine. All of these act together to increase the calcium level, so that parathyroid hormone is released in the presence of a low calcium level, and the calcium level rises, as this slide shows. On the top is the other important hormone, and that's calcitonin, and it is essentially a negative antagonist to parathyroid hormone. It's secreted by the thyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone is obviously secreted by the parathyroid gland. And it helps also regulate the calcium level, and it acts exactly the opposite. As you can see on the top here, if the calcium level becomes too high, then calcitonin is released. It causes the bone to resorb or take in more calcium. It decreases the uptake of calcium in the intestine, and decrease the reabsorption of calcium in the urine such that the calcium level will then fall in response to the calcitonin. And so these two processes act together to keep the calcium level normal in the blood. And I would suggest that you study this diagram carefully until you understand how each of these works.